Good morning. I'm like Greg and Tammy when Amy emailed me last week and said, hey, we have a lot of people signed up for this. It was like, okay, good, because I said to Greg earlier, I'm really passionate about helping people have those hard conversations because I think that's how we do good work and we build good relationships by saying some of the things that are hard to say. So I'm going to start kind of in a non-traditional way. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I'm starting this way. But I'm going to ask you for 1 minute, and I'm going to set the timer on my watch for 1 minute to close your eyes and pause. So here we go. Thank you very much. And no, you did not just walk into some woo-woo thing. I know that's everybody's, oh my God, if she's starting like this, where's she going to go? No, but we'll talk about why I begin with that. So, this is our topic for today, difficult conversations. And yes, because we're in the Success in 90 series, we're talking about difficult conversations in the workplace. Hint, hint. If you get better at the difficult conversations in the workplace, you will also get better at difficult conversations in your home and on the volunteer opportunities that you work in and in your church and all of the places. So all of the things that we're going to talk about today are transferable outside of the workplace, but we're going to focus on the workplace today. So, how many of you have had a very difficult conversation in the workplace that really went sideways? Does anybody have one that they can, in a short period of time, share without, of course, calling out anybody publicly? Yes, ma'am.
I went into a difficult conversation with someone who had literally no self-awareness of himself and did not see that any of these things were happening.
Gotcha. And what was the end result of that conversation?
The relationship is strained. There is a grudge being held.
Mm.
And so just dealing with someone who literally has no self-awareness.
Gotcha. I can tell you that in my experience, I've had more than a handful. When you get this many gray hairs, you've had more than a handful of difficult conversations that did not go well. And those lessons have taught me how to get some of them better, going better. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to share with you today what I call the 5 superpowers of collaborative leadership. And these are the things that are going to help you get better at those difficult conversations. So, here they are. Superpower number 1 is what we started with today. Pause. Superpower number 2 is listen. It is the thing that when you talk about leadership or communication or difficult conversations, listening is the one thing that most people will bring to mind. Superpower number 3 is be curious. Superpower number 4 is where I get the most pushback. and it is assume good intentions. And superpower number 5 is withhold judgment. So we're going to go through each of these, talk about how they can help you get better at those difficult conversations, and maybe even practice some of them. Okay, so this is where we started with pause. When we are in the workplace and we know that we have to go into a difficult conversation, having this general ability to take a pause, to take a breath, can help us with things like emotional regulation, thoughtful response, response versus reactivity, and those kinds of things. But most of us cannot employ pause in the middle of an emotional trigger unless we've practiced it. So, I live with my mama, my little 81-year-old mama, and she does not have any idea about personal space. She has no idea where her body is in space with regard to other things or people. And it gets on my last nerve, because I got a bubble. I don't need nobody in my bubble. So for me, when she gets in my personal space, that is an absolute trigger for me. I want to go, get up! But I know she doesn't know. So I have to be in a place where when I have that emotional trigger response, I can stop and go, okay, wait, this is my little 81-year-old mama. If y'all ever see her, she's about this big. And she has no idea that she's in my personal space. So I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to count to 3 or 500. And I'm going to not go off on my poor little old mama. So this is what pause gives us the opportunity to do. And in order for me to be able to employ that in the middle of that emotional trigger, when my mama's in my personal space, it has to be like automatic. How many of you guys have heard about the 4 levels of competence? Do you know what I'm talking about? So level number 1 is unconscious incompetence. I got no clue that I don't know what I'm doing. Level number 2 is conscious incompetence. Oh, I'm full on aware. I got no idea what I'm doing. Level number 3 is conscious competence. I know that I know what I'm doing because I am purposely working on it all the time. And level number 4 is unconscious competence. It's automatic. I don't have to think about it. I know what I'm doing. I know how it goes. That's what I'm talking about with this idea of pause. We want to be level 4 pausers, where it's automatic. I know in the middle of stressful situations, I need to be able to pause. Here's why. When we get in the middle of a difficult emotional situation, all of this stuff starts to flood our body, okay? This is your fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, that amygdala hijack, you might hear it called. And when all of these things start rushing through your body, these hormones, this is the stuff that happens. So you are having physical responses in the middle of stressful situations. And when this happens, this executive function part of your brain right up here, your prefrontal cortex, can go offline for 90 seconds. Now, I don't know about y'all, but in 90 seconds, Maelea's mouth can cause lots of havoc. Lots and lots of havoc. So we got to practice. We got to practice taking that beat, counting to 10, taking a pause. And the practice doesn't necessarily have to be in the emotionally triggering situation. If we are accustomed to that little bit of stillness, that little bit of pause in our regular daily activity, then we will be able to employ it much more easily in that moment of stress. How many people in the room think they have a pause practice? Chris, what is yours?
I mean, I do pretty similar to what we did at the beginning, just intentional time to breathe and get centered.
Cool. Who else had a hand up? Yes, sir.
One very conscious breath. One big in, one big out, one good breath.
Are there specific times that you do that?
Sure, if you have children. It lets you throw the emotional part out and lets you focus on what's really important. Not how could you have done this, but are you okay?
Yeah, for sure. Anybody else want to share? Is there anybody in this room that is a Facebook friend of mine? You might want to go look. So one of my pause practices is daily gratitude. And I decided 656 days ago, I think, I'd have to go back and look, that I was going to post a daily gratitude. So what that requires me to do is every day, I have to get up and stop and figure out something that I'm grateful for. And y'all, some days that takes me about 20 minutes because I may not be feeling great. But there's always something, you know. And so to get good at pause, you need a practice. That might be meditation. It might be prayer. It might be gratitude. It might be journaling. It might be running or yoga or sitting on your back porch in the morning, drinking your coffee and listening to the birds. Whatever that is, developing that practice of pause is going to give you the ability to stand in those emotionally charged situations and not be reactive. So, strategy number 1 for the difficult conversations is pause. Superpower number 2, collaborative leadership superpower number 2 is listen. And like I said earlier, this is the one that everybody said, oh yeah, we all know we need to be good listeners. And most people, when asked, will say, oh yeah, I'm a good listener. I'm a really good listener. Does anybody know what most of us are doing when we are listening to someone else? Yes, ma'am? Preparing our response. Absolutely. So to become a better listener, we have to actively and willingly give that up. Whew. I don't know about y'all, but I'm an Enneagram 8, and I always want to have something to say. I always want to have an answer. So it's hard to give up that I'm thinking of my response as a part of it. But to be really, really great listeners, we can't be generating our response in the listening. So let's talk about what we got to do to build that muscle memory for listening. In the same way that you got to practice the pause to get better at that, you got to practice the listen to get better at that too. So we're going to do an activity. We're going to practice. I'm going to go back one. We're going to practice what it feels like to listen and not respond. Okay? So I want you to take about 10 seconds. I'm going to use my watch again. Oops, stop that. And find a partner. We're going to do a partner activity. If there's anybody left over, then I will participate, but I'm hoping we got an even number. So, go. You got 5 or 10 seconds. Okay. All right, you ready? Here are the rules of the activity. And this activity is called a micro lab. I don't know why that's what it's called, but that's what it's called. And in this activity, we're going to have a series of 2 questions. And each part of the pair will have an opportunity to answer the question. And here's how it will go. I will pose the question. Everybody will have 1 minute to silently develop their response to the question in their head. And then I'll tell you how we're going to determine who goes first. And the person who goes first will have 2 minutes to share their answer to the question. If you are not the speaker, you have one job, and that's to listen. You are not allowed to speak. If the person who goes first only speaks for 30 seconds, then you guys are going to sit in silence for that remaining minute and a half until it's time for the other person to go. So this is not a conversation. This is, you get a question, you think of your response, you share your response with your partner who is silent. Questions? Okay. Here is the first question. What difficult conversation do you most need to have right now? And what apprehensions do you feel about having that conversation? So you got 1 minute to think. Okay. And I am remiss, I forgot to make sure. Does everybody have a partner? Come here, you and I can chat. Okay, so the person going first is the person who had the most recent birthday. So figure that out, and then I will start a timer. When's your birthday?
Changed on Friday, and then on Monday we had to have a meeting.
All right, time. Okay. All right, remember I said we're going to do 2 questions. So we have another question. We'll follow the same process. A minute to think. We'll just reverse the order. So whoever spoke second in this first round will now go first. So here's your question. What preparations do you think you could do in advance of the conversation that you were talking about that would give it more opportunity to be successful? What could you do ahead of time if you're planning for this difficult conversation to help make it more successful? So you have a minute to think. Okay, so the person who went last this past time now goes first. You have 2 minutes. Time. Okay. It's the other person's turn. Here we go, 2 minutes. All right. Thank you very much for participating. I realize that some of you all were talking probably to somebody you don't know. So thank you for entertaining that activity. Somebody talk to me about how that felt. Nightmarish. Pardon me?
It was horrible.
Nightmarish? Tell me more.
So I just want to comfort her and say all kinds of things the whole time she's talking, and she wants to do the same, and I want to go, ooh, good point, ooh, yeah. And so it's hard because you want to do active listening, but that's really just talking about yourself. But that's
Cool.
Yeah, instead of doing active listening, yes. But yeah, it's tough.
Thanks for that.
Are we going to get more time later to flesh out?
I got you. Yes, ma'am. You did? You enjoyed it?
Yeah,
Yeah, talk about that.
Well, if it's nice not to know. I don't need to respond, I just need to listen.
It's kind of freeing
Oh,
sometimes.
it is very free. It was just like, go, go. It was like, I loved it,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, sir.
So I got to tell Molly, I learned, this gentleman up here spoke about if you have kids. Well, you know, when my daughter was a teenager, I kind of learned from her because every time she opened her mouth, coming to me, talking about a problem, I felt it was my responsibility as a parent to respond. And then she silenced that one day, and she just told me, she said, every time I come to you, you always want to give advice. Sometimes I just want to rant. And I think it's human nature to want to help. So it's really a difficult exercise to just sit there and just listen without judgment, without planning what you're wanting to say, because maybe the person just wants to talk or rant.
For sure. Chris?
But I feel like active listening isn't necessarily just waiting to say something else in response. I think active listening could be prompting the person that you are listening to open up a little more, to be a little more vulnerable so they come up with their own answers. It doesn't have to be you giving them an answer.
Amen. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Yeah. Remember the next superpower is be curious. So we're going to get to that. Anybody else? So one more question. Does anybody think that you could go into one of these difficult conversations and ask for something like what you just did? In other words, we come to the table, we both know we're going to have this difficult conversation. Why don't we each take 2 minutes, not 30, 2 minutes to say where we stand on whatever the issue is at the table, and the other person cannot respond? Is that doable? Is that a strategy that you might be able to use to at least get some things out in the air?
Sometimes it might need to be like I share for 2 minutes and then give them 1 minute to be quiet and think about it.
Great idea. Yes. And this is a really good point you're making, because some people, Jessica and I were talking about being processors. You know, like, I think Jessica is a processor in here. Am I right? You process in here. Maelea processes here. So sometimes they really may need that minute, and they really may need a day or 5 days, you know. So that's a good point. But this activity of listening can sometimes be hard. Yes, sir.
We're in a cone of silence here, I'm sure. So I notice in a lot of conversations today, people are a little more fragile, and their coping skills maybe aren't what we think coping skills should be. And I've noticed sometimes you have to set some very definite parameters and expectations and say up front, this isn't personal, this isn't about you, we're talking about performance, we're talking about improving performance. Because the minute you start into one of these conversations, it's natural to go on the defensive. So sometimes if you can lay a groundwork that kind of lets people pause a little, and then think about what you're really trying to get to, you're kind of laying a groundwork that may help your odds of success.
Very, very true. Very true. All right. Thank you all for doing that. And so one of the things that I like to talk about when I talk about listening is, what are some ways to get better at it? Well, remember, you just got to practice. But here are a few suggestions that I usually throw out. Number one, set the intention. And that needs to be publicly. So if you are walking into a difficult conversation and you know it's going to be hard, say, hey, I want to be a really good listener in this conversation, and I would appreciate you holding me to that, and I would like to expect the same. Number two, get an accountability partner. Anybody in here got an accountability partner? I do. I have an accountability. It's the best thing ever. But find somebody who is in your environment on the regular and say, hey, I want to be a better listener. Will you observe me and give me some feedback? And I'm a big one about using prompts. So my mama raised me up to be a little bit of a neatnik. Some people call that OCD, but it's really not. But if there's something out of place in my environment, I notice it. So like I've literally, when I was still in the public ed space as a high school assistant principal, my desk was here. The chair that someone else might come and sit in was opposite the desk. And on the wall behind there was a big sign that said, listen. So for me, it's a visual prompt. Some people use, like they might have a rubber band on their wrist and fiddle with that so that they'll listen more effectively. But whatever your prompt is.
Before you get too far, can you spend another second on an accountability partner? What would that look like with, like, the exercise we just did? Like, are you saying use them like the exercise we just did?
Sure, absolutely. My accountability partner is someone that I talk to on the regular. She knows my goals, my intentions, the things I'm working on, and she observes some of my work and then gives me feedback on the regular. But we also have done some activities like that to get at practicing some of the things that we both want to get better at, for sure. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Practice active engagement. If you are here at Success in 90 and you've been coming to these, you know all the things about active listening. Employ those on the regular and hold yourself accountable for that. And then lastly, reflect on conversations in writing and try to do that from the other person's perspective every once in a while. If you do that perspective taking, sometimes it can be very enlightening for you as to how you come across and help you be a better listener too. So, just some thoughts about listening. And strategy number 2 is become a better listener. So we did pause, develop a pause practice, become a better listener. Now, once you get good at pause and you get really good at listen, then it's time to figure out how to be curious and be effective at being curious. When I think about curiosity, I'm thinking about digging in and getting more information and uncovering stuff. So when these conversations happen, when you're in the middle of this, get curious about things like, what stories has each person in this photograph developed in their head? What is the story in this gentleman's head? And then what's the story in this guy's head? Like what's happening in the background? I know I've had situations in my life where I have literally said this to my best friend. I know exactly what he's doing, and I know exactly why he's doing it. And we all do that, right? Like we assume that we know exactly other people's motivations. We make up a story. That our brain needs a story to try to make things make sense. So if we can give up those stories and we can give up on the assumptions and really start to dig underneath and figure out what's happening. Another question we might ask is, what's going on in the background? Did this guy's wife just ask him for a divorce? And he came to work and trying to have a conversation with people? Or did Maelea's mama get in her personal space this morning and that's why she is so riled up? I don't know. But a lot of times there's something in the background that has zero to do with what's on the table. And you need to maybe ask those questions. Is there something else going on that's impacting this conversation? So let's think about that. And that's what I mean by being curious. We need to dig in. So, how can we, in those situations, demonstrate curiosity and inspire it? And from somebody from teaching, I'm going to talk about asking great questions. When you get really good at asking questions, then you also get really good at uncovering motivation. You get good at uncovering needs that are otherwise unknown. You get good at uncovering those stories I was talking about. So getting good at asking questions is really, really helpful when you think about having difficult conversations and figuring out what's really going on, what is really the essence of what's happening. So I want you to think about asking questions kind of like a gyroscope. And if there's science people in here, I'm so sorry because I'm going to butcher it. But here's my understanding, is that a gyroscope helps vessels navigate by constant adjustment. You know, like you don't just set a course on a vessel and it just automatically goes straight to the next thing. There are all kinds of forces causing it to shift, and the gyroscope keeps you on course to get to your desired destination. Well, it's the same way when I think about asking great questions, especially in a difficult conversation. I want to ask this question and try to get this little bit of information. And then I'm going to take what I learned here, and I'm going to go around this way, and I'm going to ask another question. Because my goal is to get to the core issue so that we can address the core issue. So I like to say, think like a gyroscope. If you're in a conversation that's difficult, get curious. Ask great questions. So I'm pretty sure Amy sent you guys yesterday, because I see some of them printed out, a document that tells you the difference between clarifying questions and probing questions. And it even gives you some question stems that you might use when you're trying to come up with some of those questions and conversations that'll help people get to the core of what's really happening, or to help people think more deeply about whatever that core issue is, or maybe think differently. So I just wanted to give you guys a resource to use when you think about asking great questions. So here are a few more things that we can do to demonstrate and inquire curiosity. Number one, make time for it, for both yourself and for the other people in your sphere. This might look like a block of time in your calendar that allows you to sit down and ask questions about those relationships that you have in the workplace that might need those difficult conversations. It also might look like space on an agenda for questions so that people know we get a spot, we get a time. Here is my number one, and again, I'm going to go back to my time in teaching, and as a school administrator, pre-planning questions is the best way to get better at asking good questions. So I would say if you've got a difficult conversation in the future, and you know you've got it, minimum, write 5 questions that you want to ask that are more on the probing side than on the clarification side. You know, things that are thought-provoking. Pre-plan those questions before every important meeting that you've got coming up, or whether that's a one-on-one meeting or a team meeting. If you develop the practice of pre-planning questions, the more you do it, the better you'll get at asking questions on the fly. Because now you are building this bank of really great questions over time, and you will get better at it and better at it and better at it. And the more practice you have at developing those questions, the better those difficult conversations are going to go, because people are going to know that you're really interested, that you're asking great questions about whatever the issue is around that difficult conversation. So, strategy number 3, develop a practice of being curious. Superpower number 4, assume good intent. Yes, this is where I get all the backlash, because this is what people think. But here's how I want to talk about it. What conversations in your life or in your work would change, and how might they change if you went into a difficult conversation making the assumption that the other person wanted a good outcome just as much as you do? They're working hard for a good outcome. They're doing what they believe is right for a good outcome. How might things change if you could assume that good intent? So, when you are a great leader and you believe that everybody comes to the table ready to contribute in a positive way, this tells your people that you have confidence in them, that you believe in them. It's a different mindset and a different kind of culture. So when you do that, they are able to contribute more readily. So I'm going to go back. This is kind of on the listening side, right? I'm talking about the same things. But when we assume good intent, that means we give up the right to make up a story. If I'm going into a difficult conversation and I'm assuming good intention on the other person's part, then I am actively giving up the right to make up a story in my head. I have to admit, I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's going on. I know my perception, but I don't know, so I'm going to give up that story. I'm not going to infer meaning from behaviors or actions. I'm going to do exactly what you said earlier. I'm going to put the work first. This is a professional conversation, and I'm going to enter the dialogue trusting that that other person is going to do that. Now, I'm going to give y'all a caveat. Because I've worked with some not nice people. I was a high school assistant principal for 7 years. And I have had some people in my office for difficult one-to-one conversations, and they weren't nice. And assuming good intention does not mean that Maelea becomes a marshmallow who gets walked on. That's not what happens. Because as leaders and business people, we know we're going to have to deal with people who are difficult. But if this is in the back of my head, it's a whole lot easier for me to maintain my composure, to stay in the conversation and dig with that curiosity. It gives us more time to get to a successful resolution. If I'm not willing to assume that good intent on the front end, then I've kind of doomed it from the beginning. So this is what I'm talking about. So when we go into a conversation with trust, one of the things that it creates is safety. And one of these days you guys might get to hear me talk about psychological safety. I call that the golden rule of collaboration. People will not collaborate, they will not contribute without feeling safe in the environment. Once they feel safe, they contribute. Once they contribute fully, then your results and performance go up. So this idea of assuming good intent has all kinds of positive outcomes, not just for difficult conversations. One of the things I also, and I think this goes back to what one of you two fellas said earlier, and I'm not remembering which, but like, I might, at the onset of a difficult conversation, look at the other person and say, hey, I'm walking in here making the assumption that you want a great outcome just as much as I do. I'm not going to make up any stories in my head about what's going on with you. I'm going to listen, and I'm going to ask a lot of questions, and I'm hoping that we can come to a great outcome. So saying the thing up front, I'm walking in here this way, and you know what? I'd really like it if you could do the same. So if we need to take a pause, even walk out the door and walk back in, sometimes that you can reset with that. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about with assume good intentions. And I wanted to share this. Anybody here a James Clear fan? Atomic Habits? Love me some James Clear. He has a weekly newsletter that comes out, and I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago. He asked these questions in his newsletter, and I made a note. Oh, I need to share that at the chamber thing. He says, "What is not being said right now that needs to be said?" Oh, isn't that a great question? And what problems could we avoid in the future if only we had the courage to talk about them right now? So, again, you gotta have that safe space. You gotta enter with trust. You gotta assume good intent to be even able to ask those questions. But that is superpower number 4. I want to share with you one other way that we can help people assume good intent. And this is by using protocols. So in my work with leaders, I run some mastermind groups, we always use protocols for our conversations. And here is what this does. It provides a structure that is clear. Here's our conversation for the day. Here's how the conversation is going to go. Here's what the steps of that conversation are going to be. And it allows everybody to feel really good in the space and know when they can contribute and how they can contribute and when they don't have to. So to me, that's a safety mechanism too. Protocols make effective use of time. They keep everyone focused on the task, and they both support and require the 5 superpowers for collaborative leadership. So you know I'm all about that. So I want to share with you, and I don't have a slide for this, but I want to share with you what I call my compassionate candor protocol. So something for a difficult conversation. So when I come in as a leader, one of the first things I want to do is share what I believe to be my role. Sometimes that is, my role is to look out for the good of the organization. My role is to mentor and support the members of the organization. And my role is to help us perform as well as we can so that I can report back to my board or whatever. So I'm sharing my perception of my role as the leader. Then give the other person the opportunity to share their perception of their role. And say, what do you think your job is? Where do you think your place in the organization is? Now, let me tell you, step number 3, how I believe you to be fulfilling that role that you just told me about. And then you give me your perception. And then back up one of the superpowers and get really curious about the differences. If there are differences in perception of performance, have a time during the conversation where that is the goal. Right now, we're going to dig deep and figure out why you see it this way and I see it this way. Let's ask a bunch of questions and see if we can resolve it. And then collaborate to determine the next steps. It's like I said earlier and said to Greg, I don't think we can perform at our highest level without talking real and saying the real things. But it's got to be safe. It's got to feel okay to say the real things. So that's one way that you can do that. So strategy number 4 is assume good intentions. It's hard. Even when it's hard, talk to yourself, take that pause, and assume good intentions. Superpower number 5 is withhold judgment. For me, this is like the culmination of all the other things. If I can pause, listen, be curious, and assume good intentions, then the judgment or the decision or the plan can't come until all of those other things have happened. So that's how also, we build that belief and trust in our organization. I think I've got it on the next slide. So, when you are able to do that and not have a decision already made in your head, again, Enneagram 8, I usually know what I want to do, pretty much. I have an idea. So to do this for Maelea is really hard. But I also know that if I'm working with a team and they think on the front end that I already know what I want to do, why would they contribute? Why would they participate? So, when you're able to withhold judgment, people see you following through. They see you working a process where their voice is a part of the process, and they're more apt to buy in and support you and contribute. And they see their voice reflected in the final plan, decision, product, whatever. When you can do that, again, I speak from experience for me here, it's hard. But when you can do that, man, they will trust you. They will see you as someone building a positive culture. And all of the things that get created out of that will reflect the whole team. They'll feel valued, they'll feel empowered, and they'll be willing to be a part. Even when the work itself is hard, even when the conversation is difficult. People are willing to do hard work if they see their thumbprint on the final product or the final decision. So it's kind of like having a senior moment. Yes, it's like a continuous cycle. Thank you, Greg, for saving me. So when you as the leader pause and listen and you get curious, then you are creating a safe environment that encourages contribution. When people are willing to contribute and know that they're a part of the solution, then you get that goodwill, you're building that great culture, and they know that you're not going to make a decision without them. And then they start to see, oh man, if I'm doing this too, if I'm part of the team, and I can also pause and listen and get curious and assume good intentions, then I can contribute to the great work of our team, and I can engage in those difficult conversations because now I feel like I'm in a great space and I can say what I need to say in a safe way and be a part of great solutions. So that's them. Pause, listen, be curious, assume good intentions, and withhold judgment. So everybody in the beginning earlier shared something about a difficult conversation that was coming up. That was one of the questions in the activity that we did. Is there anything in these that you all see that could be helpful to you in an upcoming difficult conversation? Anybody willing to share an observation?
Number 5.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to a situation where I already have a strong opinion about it, but I do want to do the first 4, which could change 5. But I already have this mindset in my mind, but I am going with an open mind.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Anybody else? I'll reiterate something that I said earlier, which is I talked about these strategies in the workplace, but Jessica knows the difficult conversation I share with her is about my little mama. I love her. And I live with her. And so all of these skills and all of these strategies for getting better at difficult conversations completely transferable. So the next time you feel your heart start to pick up a beat a little bit, or if you're like me, if I get angry or agitated, I'm usually red from here to here, and I can feel that in my body, then I know those are my signals. Maelea, pause. Listen without trying to think of a response, and then get curious and ask some questions. Assume that the other person, Mama, is doing the best she can. And then don't make a decision without all of the pieces from everybody involved. I appreciate y'all. There's my deets if you need them. Anybody got any questions before we go? Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it.